If you live in the city and you've got a budget for a brand new set of wheels, there are plenty of options for you. With an imaginary budget of about $20,000, we've assembled 4 city-friendly hatchbacks to see which is the best one. And we've got 3 well-known players that top the sales charts and 1 well-regarded challenger. Each of these models represents the entry point to its respective range, and there are some big differences in terms of what you get for how much you pay. Our contenders are the big-selling Hyundai Accent Sport, the style-focused Mazda 2 Neo, the stalwart Toyota Yaris Accent, and the European-engineered Volkswagen Polo trendline. All 4 of these models are petrol-powered and come with an automatic transmission as tested. You can get a manual transmission in each of these models if you so choose, but 9 out of 10 buyers choose automatic, and so did we. These 4 models don't align perfectly on price. The most affordable car here is just under $17,000, and the most expensive car here tips in just over $21,000. But forget the price, you need to remember that these 4 are the entry-level versions of each of their model ranges, and that makes it all the more interesting if you ask me. And hey, there are higher spec versions of 3 out of 4 of these vehicles. The Accent only comes in 1 spec, but the others have options higher up if you want to spend more money and get more stuff. Make sure you read the written comparison test for all the details on what each of these cars has and what they miss out on. From here on in, we'll look at practicality, interior features, safety, ownership, and of course, how they cope with city living. First up, let's take a look at practicality. Each of these cars has 5 doors and 5 seats, but there are some marked differences in terms of how useful each is. Look, you mightn't care too much how much boot space you get in a hatchback like this. It might be a second car, it might just be a city runaround that you never take anywhere apart from the shops. But we're going to show you anyway just how useful the boots of each of these cars are. We attempted to fit the same stuff in each of these cars, the CarsGuide pram and some suitcases. As you can see, the Mazda offers the least boot space, and it's closely followed by the Toyota. The Hyundai and Volkswagen actually offer as much room as some cars in the class above. Pretty impressive, really. Now, what about rear seat space for people? I'm 182 centimeters tall, and with the driver's seat set in my position, you can see there's a marked difference in terms of legroom, headroom, and shoulder room. The Yaris feels open and airy, but it is narrow. The Volkswagen is equally tightest in the back. It and the Mazda both have the least legroom of these models, but the Mazda feels more confined due to the high window line. The Hyundai is the happy middle ground, with decent space and good seat comfort. Let's take a look at some of the features up front, starting with the media screens. Hang on, the Mazda doesn't even get a screen in this spec. In the Neo model, you still get this ridiculous little radio that sits on top of the dash that's not only hard to look at, it's actually pretty hard to operate too. Sure, you still get Bluetooth phone and audio streaming and USB connectivity, but should you feel like you're trying to use a VCR to program a radio station? No, not in 2019 you shouldn't. Hyundai's system is considerably better. It's only 5 inches, sure, but it does have Apple CarPlay, and that's enough to please about half the world today. If you're not using CarPlay, the system can be a little bit distracting because the fonts are quite small. The Yaris has a slightly larger media screen at 6.1 inches, but it can be difficult to use because the menus are quite small, and there's no smartphone mirroring tech, which can be a little bit frustrating. Plus, when you are connected to Bluetooth, you can't dial a number when you're driving. You can't pair a phone to Bluetooth when you are driving. That's another annoyance if you've got friends who want to join up to your sound system. But funnily enough, the sound system in the Yaris was the one we found to be the best. The winner for media systems is the Volkswagen Polo. It gets an 8-inch touchscreen media system with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, so you'll keep both parties happy. Plus, there are 2 USB points in here. The rest of these cars only have 1, and that means there'll be no fighting over who gets to charge up. If you're wondering about sat-nav, none of these cars have it, and none have covered center consoles, but all have cup holders down low between the seats and good-sized bottle holders in the doors. Only the Volkswagen has a digital speedometer, which could be the difference between being fine and being fined. All of these models have a lot of hard plastics on the doors and dashboards, so if you're looking for premium finishes, you might be disappointed. Now let's talk about parking, which is also safety related. The Hyundai is the only one here that doesn't come with sensors or a camera, which is just stupid for a city car. You might have guessed it from the interior shots, but the Mazda doesn't have a camera either, but it does have rear parking sensors. And the Toyota and Volkswagen both have a reversing camera, but they don't have parking sensors. So it's not ideal in any situation here. As for safety gear, each of these cars has the highest possible ANCAP safety rating of 5 stars. But believe it or not, the Accent was tested way back in 2011 and it lacks any active safety gear that would see it score 5 stars today. The Mazda 2 was tested in 2015, while the Polo and Yaris were both given the high 5 in 2017. As for technology, you can option a safety pack on the Yaris to get you auto emergency braking or AEB and lane keep assist. And that stuff is standard on the Volkswagen. The Mazda gets AEB as standard too. You can read the review for all the info. Don't expect to be blown away by the power outputs of any of these models. The Volkswagen's the only one with a 3-cylinder turbocharged downsized engine, and the killer for kilowatts is the Hyundai Accent, believe it or not. The Mazda is very light and it has good power and torque for its weight, and the Toyota, well, it's still got a 1.3 litre engine with a 4-speed auto, so it's not necessarily what you'd call zippy. Claim consumption for all 4 of these cars is pretty close, but in our real-world urban testing, which is where these cars are going to spend all their time, all were a long way over their claims. In fact, the Hyundai was alarmingly thirsty. Does the Hyundai Accent Sport deserve to have sport as part of its name? Yes, it does, because it's got a really zippy engine. It's a big engine for this class, and with big power outputs, as you may have seen earlier in this video. But it's not the most refined engine. It's not the most efficient engine, and it's not the most fun engine either. The transmission is pretty good. It's got 6 gears to play with, and it makes good use of them for the most part. There's a manual mode if you want to engage it, just like all the other cars here, but you wouldn't bother. It does a pretty good job in most situations, and it can be left to its own devices, which is good. Now, I'm not the only one who's driven these cars over the last couple of days. There's been plenty of the CarsGuide team in and out of each of these 4 vehicles, and the Accent has been the one that's actually surprised a few of them. It's mainly down to the fact that it drives really nicely. Well, that's what the general consensus is. The ride is firm but controlled. The steering's really predictable, nicely weighted, but a little bit of sportiness to it as well. I don't personally enjoy the steering that much. I think it gets a bit strangely weighted at low speeds, especially when you're trying to park. And that's difficult enough as it is because you don't have a camera or sensors to use. And I think one of the things that most people like about it is that it feels really connected to the road. It's got quite a firm suspension setup, and it's also the only one with alloy wheels, so that plays into it as well. One thing you will notice in the Accent is that it's a bit noisier than some of the other cars here. Not as noisy as the Mazda, which is the loudest by quite some margin, but you do notice the engine noise and tyre noise in this car more than, say, the Yaris or the Polo. Overall, the Accent is pretty impressive. I can see why they've sold so many of them, but for a city car, the lack of a camera and sensors is just a bit weird. It seems like every time we review a Mazda, we talk about how nicely it steers, and the Mazda 2 is no exception. It does steer really well. You feel quite involved in the whole situation, unlike some of its competitors, and it's fun to drive, for the most part. The things that make it fun to drive include the fact that it handles quite nicely. It's light and agile. The steering, again, makes a big difference. But the engine is, well, not terrific. I would say that it feels reluctant at times to accelerate. It can be wheezy, almost asthmatic in its response. But the transmission does a pretty good job at harnessing what power is there. Put it in sport mode and you'll enjoy it even more. But the noise that accompanies that, well, it doesn't sound terrific. It may have good handling, but the ride of the Mazda 2 can be quite harsh. It It can jostle over bumps and feel a little bit sketchy when you hit a patchy section of road. It's not as refined as some of its competitors in that regard. Plus, the vision from the driver's seat isn't terrific. I found that this side mirror on the driver's side, well, it's not convex, so it's really hard to judge what's behind you and what's coming up next to you. And I'm not the only one who's experienced that. Overall, the Mazda 2 is probably the most fun of these four cars to drive, as long as you're not accelerating. This 1.3 litre with a 4-speed automatic is old school, like it's feeling its age. And the transmission, well, only 4 gears, you don't really have enough to make the most of its torque band. And when it's at higher revs, you do rev hard. But that said, I've found that the drivetrain in the Yaris is actually perfectly fine for day-to-day duties. Sure, you're not going to speed up hills or accelerate away from lights where you leave WRXs in your wake, but this is fine for what it's designed for. Well, that's the engine and the transmission anyway. The steering isn't terrific. It can be a little bit oddly weighted at times, particularly when you're coming from a high speed down to a low speed. It can maybe not be as well judged as it could be, but it is really, really light at low speeds, so it makes it easy to park. As for the suspension, well, it's focused more on comfort than control, so it's really soft, and that means that you can get thrown around and wobbled in your seat, especially if you're in the back. We noticed that when we had 4 people in the car earlier on the test. What we found in this test is that the Yaris Accent model isn't fantastic, but nor is it really terrible. There's a reason that so many people have bought the Yaris over the years, and the base model makes a fair bit of sense. The thing you notice first when you drive the Polo is not just the 3-cylinder rumble, but also the thrust of the turbocharged engine. You feel more torque, you feel more pulling power, and that can be really enjoyable in city driving. But the issue with the drivetrain is that it does have a little bit of lag to contend with. Because it's got a dual clutch transmission, which needs to think about what it's going to do a little bit more than the other cars here, plus it's the only car here with engine stop start, you've really got to have a bit of a think about how you accelerate from a traffic light or a roundabout. So it's not plug and play like the other cars here, but it does feel more mature on the road by some margin. In fact, I would think of this car as, well, the adult of this group. I would say that the steering of the Polo is probably the most enjoyable for me. It isn't necessarily the most fun to drive, but it's really well judged, and also the weighting of it is perfect. And in terms of ride comfort, you do feel more of those little bumps coming into the cabin, but it's more resolved overall. This is a really, really impressive little city car. Your preferences will determine which one of these 4 cars you choose, there's no doubt about that. You might choose the Mazda because of its cute looks, but I would thoroughly recommend you shop up a little bit to the Max model, which gets alloy wheels and a media screen, which really it should already have at this price point. The Toyota Yaris, well, I'd buy the base model of that because I think it makes the most sense. It isn't the greatest car to drive, but geez, it gets the job done. The Hyundai Accent may be thirsty, but it is peppy and it's got a very roomy cabin. Plus, it's got pretty impressive ownership credentials. But our winner is the Volkswagen Polo. Yes, we know that price is important at this level of the market, but it offers the best experience for the money. There's no doubt about that. Quality engineering, a quality car, and it's our winner in this comparison test. Tell us what you think. Have we got it right? Would you choose the Volkswagen over the other cars here, or would you choose something completely different? Let us know in the comments section below, and also don't forget to hit subscribe.